so much, and thank everybody for joining. I know everybody has very busy schedules. I want to take you through just the best practices of an effective retirement plan committee. And we're going to start really just at the very basics of how to really compose your committee. For everybody, it's going to be a little different. In terms of this presentation, I'm going to be focused more on groups that have one committee. I know that some of your organizations might actually divide it to two committees, where you have a group that handles the administrative side and a group that handles the investment side. Usually during the conferences, we only have one or two people that applies to. So for all my comments, I'm really going to focus on one committee that operates on both of those. So how many people should be on the committee? Well, just like any given situation where you're going to have voting, it's really best to have an odd number. So somewhere between 3 and 9 people. If you have a large organization and there's a lot of people that you feel like want to be part of the group, going above 9 is just very difficult. Getting a consensus and getting good dialogue for above 9 is often hard. And again, you have to balance your culture and what's really important, but that's what we recommend. Really 5 to 7 we feel like has been a great number as well. It just can be very effective. But you want to make sure the people that you're actually asking to be on the committee are the right people as well. And what I mean by that, you're usually going to have your CFO, your head of HR, maybe your retirement specialist. But if you're also extending it out to, say, the CEO, if the CEO is traveling almost every week, that's a very difficult person to have. You don't have to have your CEO. You can have somebody who maybe is their second in command or works directly for him that can or her for that matter, and can update them on what happens during the committee meetings. But if they're not able to be there, what's going to happen is when you go in to document who is at those meetings, he's going to be listed as a member of the committee, but then by not being there, it just shows a lack of fiduciary responsibility. And it is important to explain to everybody who's coming in and acting on the committee that they are fiduciaries. Even if you hire an advisor who's also a fiduciary, you can't take that responsibility away from the committee members. So again, okay, let's go back to who are people you want and don't want. You don't want anybody when you go into a conversation who you can't share information with. You never want to have somebody in the room who you have to say, you know what, hold on, would you step out for a second while we discuss this and then come back in? That is not a person. You want to have somebody who really has that confidentiality and can also have decision-making ability. Really, it's best, and again, every culture is a little different, it's really best if you have somebody on the committee who can have a voice. We really don't like to see when, say, a CEO is on the committee and people go to vote and everybody turns to look at what he or she is doing. So you really want to have people that are really thinking through the decisions and having a voice. Some of the larger committees, especially, we see people that rotate on and off. We recommend that you at least have 5-year term limits if you are having some people rotate on and off. The reason we do this is by the time people really understand and get trained on their fiduciary responsibility, you don't want to turn around and have somebody else coming on board. Also, if a number of your spots, let's say you have 5 people on your committee, you've got the CFO, the HR, and then you have 3 other positions, and you rotate those. Try to rotate each one of those at different times, different intervals. And a lot of times, if you're going to have something that intricate, you want to maybe set up, and we'll get to this as well in the next slide, but a charter that really outlines this. And with that, it kind of goes into the training. What training is needed for new and existing members? You want to make sure when a member comes on board, they're using that opportunity for training the whole committee. Because a lot of times, people will forget or they just need a refresher on what's going on. And when a new person comes on, you want to make sure they really understand what's going on. So you want to make sure they understand what the purpose of the meeting is, what their role is, the voting requirements, and a lot of people will want to know, okay, how long am I committed to do this? So again, for best practices, for those little bit more complex committees, we do say that a committee charter is very helpful. Now that's different than your investment policy statement. A committee charter just simply outlines what's your role, what you're required or obligated to do as a committee member, and really lays it out. Again, setting people's expectations from the beginning really helps everyone. Also, adding that additional level of training really helps everyone. I'm sure everybody on the call had their first time when they sat in on a retirement discussion and were completely overwhelmed. For any of you who have seen the movie Arrival, it is about aliens coming to Earth and hovering above the Earth, and the Army goes to a woman who specializes in languages, in communicating with people and learning language and dialects. And so she goes in and she's trying to talk to the aliens, and she's coming out, and she's exhausted and taking off her gear, and the general says to her, okay, we've got to hurry. You know, we've got to move this forward. We've got to find out if they're here to hurt us or to help us. And she says, when the settlers went to Australia, they saw kangaroos. And so they asked the Aborigines, wow, what are these amazing animals that we see hopping around? We've never seen anything like it. And the Aborigines responded, kangaroos. Well, it turns out that kangaroo in Aborigine means I don't know what you're asking me. So the general goes, okay, I get it. And she goes, yes, you have to establish a language and make sure that people are understanding what you're saying. Because otherwise, if you stick these people in this retirement committee and you start throwing out, quadros and QDIA and default and ERISA and all these terms that we've come to know and love, they won't have any idea what's going on. And one of two things will happen. They'll raise their hand and they'll ask, or they'll nod along because they don't want anybody to know that they don't know what they're doing. So again, we feel like it's really important to have that baseline of training. So as we think about the structure, we want to really think about all of our service agreements. First and foremost, you want to make sure that you understand your service agreements, and so does your investment committee. And what I mean by that is everything from the plan document that sets up your plan, but also your engagement with your advisor. You want to make sure there's no blocking language between you and your advisor. If something were to come up and you got into litigation with maybe one of your employees, you'd want to make sure that you and your advisor were sitting on the same side of the table. There wasn't any blocking language that would require you to arbitrate. There wouldn't be anything that would have to force you to prove that they were negligent. You want them on the same side of the table with you, and that's very important. You also want an IPS, the investment policy statement. You want that set up to guide your committee through their responsibilities, but also not to back you into a corner. We on purpose use soft language in our IPS. We use words like we prefer to or we should do this. That way you've got some leniencies. Things come up. If you put in your IPS criteria, we will meet every single quarter. Well, if something major comes up, it gets pushed out, and you don't meet it every single quarter, then all of a sudden you're in violation of that. So again, you want to put in some softer language, but again, language that guides the committee and helps them understand what their role is, and helps somebody from the outside, if they were reading it, understand what your process as a fiduciary has been. The IPS is not a legal document. However, it has been a document that has been required to be given to a participant when requested by a judge. So you want the IPS criteria also to support your reports. So your quarterly monitoring reports that you get and discuss with your committee, you want everything that goes into those reports to follow what your IPS criteria is. You shouldn't outline the criteria that you're going to monitor and then not have that as part of your reports. Plain and simple. A lot of this, again, goes back to just common sense. Again, all these plan documents really work as your structure. Then you move in more to your discipline. Again, if you say that you're going to meet quarterly, you can put that in there. We'd recommend softer language. But then you need to do exactly what you said you're going to do in those documents. And again, wording is very important. We always joke when we were talking about the structure that, Jerry Maguire, when he was making the deal and his client said, oh, but my word is stronger than oak. Well, that didn't work out for him very well. You've got, just like that, you want to get everything that has to do with the retirement plan in writing. And that brings us to the last point of documentation. and I will kind of come back to this slide by slide, but documentation is the most important thing. I think my family always laughs at me. I'm very much a list person. I write everything down, and at times I've even gone to my list after doing a task and realized that I forgot to write it down on my list, and I will actually write it down to cross it off. So if you are like me and have that that little eccentricity, then you're perfect for retirement plans, because if you don't write it down, it doesn't count. You can't later go back and be like, oh, yeah, we did that too. If it's not in the file, especially when the DOL comes, then they perceive that it didn't happen, and you have to go through a lot more explanation. And first and foremost, if the DOL comes in, the first thing they're going to ask you for is 3 years of minutes and documentation of what's gone on with your plan. So going into that, you really want to think through, again, where you're accepting responsibility. You want people who work for you on your plan, and this is being pushed more and more now with the new DOL ruling going into effect, but that accept professional responsibility. We also believe that your advisor should come in and hold harmless your committee members, the company, and the officers. So again, not limiting you to arbitration, you want to make sure that everybody who's working on your plan is sitting on the same side of the table, because really your advisors are part of your committee, and you want to make sure you're understanding how your team really operates. So again, everybody who's part of the committee is a fiduciary, and everybody now, according to the DOL ruling, who's in there giving you advice is acting as a fiduciary. So again, a little change in these new nuances, but it's really important, and it's really important to have the conversation with your committee members about the new DOL ruling. I'm actually talking to a large group tomorrow in Texas, $130 million plan, and nobody from their record keeper had ever talked to them about the new DOL ruling, even to give them an update of what was going on. And they simply said, well, they don't have an advisor, so we didn't feel like it was relevant. Well, but they have a broker within their record keeper that constantly calls them and is offering to give them advice on their retirement accounts. So really, it comes into play. So educating your members on what's going on, again, utilizing some of these changes as training opportunities is always a best practice. So again, fiduciary responsibilities, it really comes into play with audits, regulatory action, and litigation. For a long time, we are seeing the same cases referenced over and over again in all of our materials because those were the big cases. Now, I am seeing new litigation and new cases come across my email almost every day. And we're seeing more and more cases in, I would say, mid-sized plans versus the really large plans. What litigating attorneys realized is this is a key market they can focus on, and if they prove their case on a smaller plan, they can then take it upstream and make it a larger civil suit. So it is important to know that with retirement plans, because it affects everyone the same, you only need one person for a civil suit. So it really is kind of a perfect situation for a litigating attorney. With that, you want to make sure that within your plan and within your committee, everybody does have the best interest of your clients and your participants. You want to make sure you're eliminating conflicts of interest. And a part of this is really eliminating the soft dollars in compensation. So if you're now working with somebody who's getting soft dollar compensation, especially if they are getting additional compensation on maybe doing models for specific models within your plan, that is an area we've seen that is extremely problematic. And actually just recently in the last couple of days, we actually saw a potential litigation coming on it. So we definitely want to address that and get rid of those soft dollars, especially with these new rulings. So the risk protocol, I'm sorry, I don't know why some of these slides aren't quite showing up. But with that, you want to make sure who is ever working for you has professional liability insurance and is showing you that. With that, you don't just want to have typical E&O insurance. You want to make sure it's specific to ERISA, because most policies don't specifically cover ERISA. Again, eliminate the conflicts of interest, but by doing that too, you want to make sure they're not soliciting your participants. If you hire somebody to come in, and this has been a model for years and years, there's nothing wrong with it, but a lot of people would come in to work on your retirement plan, And part of that motivation was that they wanted to then solicit your participants and probably more focused on your C-suite. Now with the DOL ruling, if they end up making additional money because of that, that is a conflict. Also, by you having them in there, if there's any problem with that transaction, whether they sell them an annuity or an insurance, you are the one backing that and you are actually liable. So that is where we've seen people, too, being pulled into litigation in those situations. So again, all of this is just how you're structuring your committee, who you're putting on your team to work with you. Again, we talked about foundation documents, establishing the rules, how decisions are made. That is the key in all documentation. It's really documenting how decisions are made. You want to make sure that you're actually showing the quantitative and the qualitative guides that you're evaluating your funds and your plan. So within every single plan, you're going to have a lot of different funds. You want to make sure that you're adding funds, and your committee is really looking at these funds to create, to have your participants have a diversified allocation, that they can create a diversified portfolio, but you don't want to put funds in there that might be more appropriate for a high net worth client. For example, limited universe and fragmented characteristics are really what we're focusing on here. Limited universe, real estate funds. There's only about 75 real estate funds. So when you're looking and monitoring these funds, it's very easy to go from looking like a hero to looking like a goat. So you have to say in your IPS criteria, we're going to look at these funds differently in this limited universe than we would look at, say, a large cap growth fund that has thousands of options. So making those nuances is important, and really deciding, okay, how many limited universe funds do we need? How many really bring a benefit and really do help diversify our offering? Fragmented categories sometimes really just bring on more trouble for a fiduciary than they help. You would have to have a documented reasons why you had, say, the Japan-focused fund. If you have a fund that's only investing in Japan, there's several of them, but there's not very many. There's, I'd say 12. But if you decided to have that, that's going to be a highly volatile fund, and you have to document why did you put that in a retirement plan for other people's money. Was that the best option? Or for foreign exposure, would it be better to have something that's more diversified, that's not going to have that level of volatility and have a longer, stronger track record? That's really where you want to focus. So again, it's documenting, though, how you're looking at these things. Socially responsible. We have several clients that it is very important to their culture to have a socially responsible fund. Well, because these are very, very hard to monitor, what you end up having in this category are a lot of different funds that aren't alike. So again, you've got to document how exactly you're looking at those funds. So if somebody were to come in and say, why did you keep this fund? It was underperforming. Well, underperforming compared to what? So you really, again, are looking at how you're documenting those. Target dates are a lot of the same as well, and we'll get into that a little bit more specifically. You want to always look at the quantitative results, talent, stewardship. PIMCO is always my example. Here was a great organization. Everybody had PIMCO funds in there, or the majority of plans had PIMCO in there, and then all of a sudden they were losing not just thousands of dollars, not just millions of dollars, but billions of dollars. They lost 50% of their overall holdings. So again, when you see a mass exodus of your senior talent, you see funds that are flowing out, you have to document if you were to make the decision to keep those funds, because somebody could come back. Even now, PIMCO's in a series of lawsuits, could come back and say, why didn't you take action on these funds, especially when dealing with other people's money? That is a constant trigger that you have to look at. And the trigger is for the watch list items, really showing what documents that. Just because your committee puts something on the watch list or your advisor brings you a report showing you that you have a watch list item, that doesn't mean that it's on the way to replacement. That simply means that something's gone on that we want to make sure and document if something were to happen down the road. And again, you want to use soft language. Action should or will be taken and not absolutes, so that you can explain if, for example, if one of your watch list criteria says if there's manager tenure and that manager doesn't have at least a certain track history. Well, there takes time to be the meeting, and then there takes time to be the research. So again, giving yourself some of that flexibility within your requirements. Target date and capital preservation options are both examples of areas we're seeing more and more litigation. But again, these are two areas that you really have more of limited universe and, again, fragmented categories. There's only about 44 target date funds. So you really have to make sure that you're documenting exactly what's going on with those funds. We have found that, and I think a lot of advisors have done this, where creating more proprietary reports. It's hard to get a lot more information for both of these fund categories than just the marketing materials. So really being able to look and drill down of what's going on within these, especially with target dates often being the default and often being the largest fund or holder of assets within the plan. Capital preservation is another one. Right now, money market is flat, and a lot of people are taking advantage of stable value funds within the plan, and that is great. But again, stable value funds work differently, so you want to make sure your committee is looking and understanding how a stable value fund works, and we'll get into that as well. So I joke because I know that this is actually probably a little easier to see on your computers versus the PowerPoint, but even in the handouts that I'll follow up with, it's a little hard to see, but I joke that if you are only reviewing enough information that would make a good PowerPoint, then you're not reviewing enough information for each fund. So this is an example of our target date report. So I'm going to highlight a few boxes, and this is for the Vanguard target date series. We're going to flip over. So it highlighted the equity funds. I recently was talking to a CFO at a conference, and he said, "Oh, no, I totally understand how target date reports, and I think most of my employees understand too. They're well educated." And I said, "Oh, okay." And his counterpart said, "I'm not sure I totally understand it." He goes, "Oh, well, the Vanguard target dates are made up of hundreds of funds." Well, they're made up of 5 funds, 5 index funds. Now, some of them are made up of more. T. Rowe Price has 19, J.P. Morgan has 26. But again, it was just a misconception that he got somewhere along the road. And again, it's the reason why training on a regular basis to committees is very helpful, because whether it's the reports or the actual training, it helps people have a better understanding of what's going on in the plan. And, these are very dynamic plans. It's a constant learning process. So in the Vanguard Target Fund 2040, it only has 2 equity funds, the total stock and the international stock. Now, recently, in the last 2 years, Vanguard has said within its equity allocation, it is bumping its foreign exposure from 30 to 40. Again, something you want to document, especially if it's a large percentage of your plan. And you want your committee to understand these type of nuances. So then if you say, okay, well, how is it allocated? Well, then you can see it's still diversified across large, mid, and small companies, value, blend, and growth. Again, this is 2040, so this is somebody who's a little over 40 years old, and this is going to keep dialing down that equity exposure all the way until retirement. Another thing to note, for example, on the Vanguard Target Date Series, is they don't invest in anything below investment grade. Now, that's not to say that makes them the best Target Date Series, but that is a very distinguishable characteristic that if you have the Vanguard Target Date, you want to make sure everybody on your committee understands that, and again, understands how these funds work. Again, another slide that looks at as way too much information for a great PowerPoint, but gives you a lot of information about the fund. This is for Wells Fargo Stable Value. This is our proprietary report about stable value funds, and I'm going to highlight a few areas, and then I'm going to show you them closer. So some of the things you want to know, we give a commentary of what's going on with the report, but things you want your committee to know, you want them to understand the net crediting rate. That is actually the amount they're making over the dollar for dollar. Now this part isn't guaranteed. For stable value plans, you want your committee members to understand it's dollar in, dollar out. But then you want them to understand what are our participants getting on top of that. So right now the net crediting rate is 1.81. Okay, well they also need to understand the market to book ratio. And what that means is that's actually what it's valued at right now. So it's just really at 100%. If it went under 100%, that means it actually is valued below $1. Well, so why is that important? Well, that means if your participant wants that $1, this Wells Fargo is going to pay them the $1. Well, where are they going to make up the difference? All these underlying insurance companies are making up the difference. So, for example, Prudential is making up 15% of that difference. So we want to make sure that Prudential has a stable outlook, because if all of a sudden they switch to a negative outlook, all of a sudden then American General gets a negative outlook, Transamerica, and granted, highly unlikely it would all happen at once, but when you start seeing that, all of a sudden the value of this Wells Fargo fund could deteriorate, and you want to make sure you're watching that and really observing that. Because just like any other fund, your target date series and your capital preservation can be funds your committee reviews and says, okay, this isn't the best option for our committee anymore. A lot of the work can be done in pre-meeting prep. And I definitely stress to all the plan sponsors that a lot of this work seems overwhelming. There's been a lot of, okay, we need to do this, we need to do this. You hire people to do these things. A lot of this can be delegated work, and you can especially delegate the pre-meeting prep. For most of my clients and for other advisors I've talked to, we really run our meetings. We work directly with the record keeper. We're in partnership with the record keeper. That's the best way for your meetings to be run. It's the best way for you as a plan sponsor. The last thing you need is to be trying to separate your advisor from a record keeper because they maybe don't get along or don't have the same perspective. They need to be working for you and making your life easier. What I recommend is have your advisors really set up your meetings. Work with your record keepers ahead of time. Make sure that they're not that we're not giving duplicate information, but instead really complementary information. Have them decide if there's any red flags. Everybody hands you a very large book usually of information and stats. What you want to make sure is there isn't a blinking light. Just like your lights on your dashboard of your car, if you've got a light blinking, you want to understand what that means. Is it a check engine light or is it put more washer fluid in? There's big differences between those two. And you want to make sure that your advisor and your record keeper are really coming in and helping look at those, helping you plan if major stats are changing, and also improvements. You want to document what's happening with your plan in every aspect. From a PR standpoint, you also want to be communicating if you bring the fees down, if you make enhancements. You really want to look at all of that. You also want to make sure you're documenting best practices. You can get these, again, from your, and expect them from both your advisor and your record keeper. But even if you think your culture is not a good culture for automatic enrollment, it's a best practice now. It should be documented that your committee has considered it. And with that said, when you document, okay, we've decided not to do auto-enrollment, don't say, we don't want to do it because we don't want to hear our participants complain. We don't want another hassle. You just simply say something to the effect of, auto-enrollment does not fit the culture of our organization, and we feel like it's not appropriate at this time. Plain and simple. With that, we're going to get into the excuse me, the meeting minutes in a minute too, and I'll go through some of that. Again, all of these things All of these deliverables are things you can ask your advisor and your record keeper for as well. Your quarterly monitoring report, all the reports too that look at the funds, especially when you're doing a replacement, in lots of different ways. You want to make sure that you're looking at it from every angle. We all know that statistics can really make anything look any way. And so you want to make sure that you're not just looking at something from the front, but from all directions. It's funny, I was telling the story at this last Chicago conference that right before I left, I was driving down the street, stopped at a light, and I looked up, and a woman was coming out of her house, and she's very pretty and very fit. And all of a sudden I realized that she was adjusting something on her head. In the pretty white sundress that I took, I quickly realized that she had a veil on, and it was a wedding dress. As she continued to turn, I realized that what from the front looked like a very thin, fit woman was also a very pregnant woman. So it's funny. My first look in that first initial head-on look, all I saw was a pretty fit woman in a white sundress, probably going to some fun thing. Within the next 30 seconds, really looking at all the details, well, she was about to get married and she was about to have a baby. These were all major things that if you didn't notice everything, you would have missed something pretty important. So again, you want to look at all these different funds from all different reporting ways and make sure your committee is fully understanding what is going on within your plan. So this gives you an example of a quarterly monitoring report. Again, lots of information. Hopefully this is easier to see on your computers than it was on the presentation. But this is an example of an actual prospect we have or had, and it's almost a $16 million plan, and it's all in A shares. If your committee is looking at your investments right now and you are in A shares, that should be addressed right away. There's no reason for a retirement plan really at any size at this point to still be in retail shares. It's just too expensive for your participants, and we're seeing litigation on it from all angles. Excuse me. So with this being said, you see that there's a lot of recommended action. Watch list, so we want to document everything that's going on in each of those funds, and then there's a replacement. So let's see how we'd recommend to handle that with a committee. Anything you're seeing in yellow means it's underperforming. So there's a lot of underperformance here, but maybe not as much as we might think. Let's look. This last fund, this bold fund, is the incumbent fund, the fund currently in the plan. Now, one of the things again, this is so small and I apologize, but you see the NA, which means it doesn't have a 10 years history. You really do want long-standing funds that have a consistent history when putting them into a plan for other people's money. So again, it's A shares, it's very expensive, and it doesn't have a long track history. On top of that, we've got a lot of underperformance. So again, the main reason I show this is because you want to show lots of different angles. This report is a first page. There's 3 pages like this of a lot of numbers, and then we switch it up to more of a visual because you do want to press onto both your advisors and record keeper to communicate to your committee in a way that they can understand. Not everybody on your committee is going to be a numbers person, and so whether it's through the training or through the reporting, you want to make sure it's clear to everybody. Because at the end of the day, especially if you're working with the 321, at the end of the day, the committee is going to be voting, and they have to be comfortable with their decision. So however you're going through the process, you want to make sure at the end of it, each one of them is comfortable with raising their hand and saying, yes, I want to replace, I'm comfortable with this new fund. Again, they're fiduciary just like the advisor. So one of the things we do is this visual. This is a risk-reward. So as you go over to the right, you've got, oh, you know what, and I have the ability to kind of show you this. As you go over to the right, you've got more risk, and as you go up, you have greater performance. So the current fund, oh, I've got to drag this guy. The current fund is right here. So it's taking on more risk. The benchmark is this little house. It's taking on more risk, and it's slightly underperforming. We can also look at the up-down capture. This is one of these great stats. And again, the Putnam Fund is the one that we're looking at. So for the up-down capture, what that means is if the market goes up 100%, then this fund goes up 91%. Not too bad. However, if the market goes down 100%, this is experiencing 97%. That is not the way we want that ratio. We want that ratio to look more like the MFS. If it goes up 100%, it experiences 101. If it goes down, it experiences 90. You want to have good, solid historical returns, but you also want to hedge for when markets go down because people get very, very nervous very quickly. So again, it's all of these things to make your committee members feel comfortable and really have them have a good understanding. Again, pushing a lot of this responsibility to your advisors and record keepers to help you really get these projects done. Part of that is your current 4A-B disclosure from the record keeper and from your advisor. You can get that, and then you can benchmark your fees. We do recommend that you benchmark your fees on a regular basis every 2 to 3 years. If you've done a transition, that accounts for that as well. But also really looking at best practices within those. Are your participants really in a situation where they're paying all different fees across the board? This is an example of one of our record keepers, how they give you the fees. It is very, very, very confusing for most people. You've got annual expenses, you've got annual cost, you've got this number, and then it's subtracted from this number, and then you get this number. It's not necessarily a bad way to do it. It's just confusing, and often it's confusing for your participants. And not your participants, excuse me, for your committee members. So often what you can do is have your advisor drill that down and do a comparison. So you really have a place to one of two things. First of all, document your compliance file saying, yes, we're competitive in our industry and we're priced well. It also gives you a place to start conversations with your record keeper. The record keepers are very used to negotiating fees. They've been pushed on fees quite a bit. They can tell you, okay, this is how much we need to operate this fund, and then they can work with you to establish what's the best way to set up the fees for you. So in this situation, you want to make sure when you're documenting and benchmarking that you're really looking at apples to apples. So everybody does it a little bit different. Some of these use an annual base fee, some of them use a per participant fee, and some of them just use revenue sharing. So again, what you're looking at is the gross annual fee, so really comparing each one of them. So the current option is more expensive. You will find this, especially if you haven't done benchmarking in quite a while. Do not let your committees be too overwhelmed by that because the fees have come down so much in the last few years. For the people that have done transitions more recently, your fees are going to be lower than if you haven't looked at this in the last 5 years. So again, it's just a jumping off point to document your files. Another area of the fees that we've really seen a problem is when several of the funds are paying a lot more expenses than the other. And why is this a problem? Well, that means that people invested in those funds are paying all of your expenses, especially if you're using a revenue sharing model. This example shows that the Wells Fargo fund, again, a good fund, these are the plan assets, the total revenue sharing was 57%. So that's the total amount of the fees that the money from these funds are paying, and it's only 17% of the assets. So the rest of the 42% of the plan is only paying 82%. Excuse me. The rest of the revenue sharing, the 42, is the rest of the 82% of the total plan assets. So it's extremely unfair to the people that are in the Wells Fargo plan. They're paying, just shy of 60% of the funds, and they only make up 17% of the plan assets. So what you can do is several different things. You can strip out down to the very lowest share class. Your committee can just vote to do that and take that down. You might still have a little bit of revenue sharing. At that point, you can actually credit that revenue sharing back to those participants. Again, working with your record keeper to say, what do you need to operate this plan? They can give you a set number or basis points number, and you can back into that. You can do it a lot of different ways. You can do it per participant. You can even do it pro rata, which is based on the account size. We also have people that say, the company says, okay, I'll chip in this amount, and then the rest of it is divided among the participants on a per participant basis. There's a lot of flexibility within these record keepers, so you can set it up whichever way works best for you. So again, everything needs to be documented. It comes back to the meeting minutes. So your committee has now discussed everything from the structure to the funds to the fees. Now you've got to make sure that everything is documented. Again, going back to that list and writing it down as you check it off. You want to make sure, too, that it, again, is written for the exclusive benefit of your participants. Everything that y'all decide to do, you want to make sure you're writing it down to capture that you're really thinking of them first. You can, by doing that, sometimes you are going to run into challenges, but you can word them as opportunities. We're not, we're reviewing the fees. We're looking at the capabilities of the record keepers. Not all record keepers, for example, can credit back the revenue sharing directly to the participants. We're researching that. Make note of that. What you want to make sure you don't do is write down that you're researching or following up on something and then never have anything else in your minutes to show that. I'd highly recommend that you have your advisors edit your notes. And if they're a new advisor, I'd have them look at your previous notes to make sure there's nothing in there that could be misconstrued. A lot of times, too, if we come into a new relationship and they haven't documented, we help them build out year-end minutes. So if the DOL were to come in and say, we'd like to see the last 3 years of your minutes, what have you done for your plan, we actually create year-end, so it documents what's happened for the plan. Because a lot of times people do a lot of great things, make good decisions, but they didn't write it down, so they haven't documented. Again, you just want to make sure that everything is documented and concise. Sorry, let me get rid of this little pointer. Now everything within, it's funny, I just, again, talked to somebody at conference, and they were an organization that actually does projects for the government. So he said that they actually had a reporter in there, like a court stenographer, actually taking every single word. That is very dangerous. I don't know about your committees, but the majority of committees that I meet with, there's a lot of side conversation. There's a lot of comments, maybe even joking or sarcastic, that do not need to be captured in the minutes. You also do not need to capture anything your advisor explains about, like general commentary. Reference the reports that they bring. Reference tabs, reference that they cover that. You just don't have to get that specific. Again, you don't want to accidentally misrepresent something that was said and actually put something down that could hurt you. High-level discussions, of course, always are a good way to end your meeting. What is working, what's not working? Now, there will be time when you're really in the nitty-gritty of your plan, especially if you're making a lot of changes, that it's not the right time to say, okay, really look at these things. But when your plan's running well, that's when you really sit back and say, okay, what's working, what's not, what improvements? That's when you ask your record keeper and your advisors to say, bring us some best practices we haven't considered, or bring us a training that we can go over for 15 minutes during the meeting. Excuse me, my allergies, I'm coughing a little bit. And then also, what are the immediate actions? You want to make sure that when you put something in the minutes that say we're going to follow up and have immediate action, that you do show that follow-up and document that that was done. You also want to look at the calendar. My most successful committees are ones that actually at the end of every meeting look ahead and say when the next meeting is going to be. Everybody's busy, and if it's on their calendar, it usually really helps. Also utilizing the record keepers and saying, okay, what can we do in terms of our campaign? Let's really make sure that our committee is on board and has a voice in what they think we should do. If you've got managers within your committee or people that oversee certain departments and say, you know what, I've really noticed that my group is mainly over 50 years old or 55, and so many of them are talking about retirement. Can we have something, seminar where we actually partner with Social Security, the record keeper, the advisor, and really bring everybody in to help them do some planning? And that's all things that you could definitely do, and we've seen a lot of committees orchestrate those that have been very successful. So again, it's just really areas to think about. Committees can be great. They don't have to be a huge burden to you. You've hired people. Utilize the people you've hired to really take on these projects. I will add that if anybody's interested, they can let us know that we have an annual due diligence we provide to our clients that just goes through what our services are and really outlines what we do. We create, from this presentation, we actually created it, and we actually give it to other plan sponsors so they can send it to their advisors. It doesn't have our logo or anything on it. They can send it to their advisors so they have documented in their file exactly what their advisor is doing for them, so that they can then take it to the committee and say, okay, we've documented, this is our advisor, this is what he's doing for us. And then if there's questions of maybe something they're not doing at this present time that you'd like them to, then it can initiate conversations as well. So with that, are there any questions?
Hi, Sarah. Yes, there was one that came in. One question asked, how long do you have to keep minutes from prior years?
For most ERISA, the statute of limitation is 7 years. So as best practices, I would probably keep them for 7 years. Usually when the DOL comes in, they'll only ask for 3 years. But best practices is 7.
And another question that just came in, we have design questions. Should those go through the investment committee? Sometimes I get confused about whether auto-enroll 1,000 rollover limit should go through this committee or not.
It does depend. I kind of referenced it at the beginning if you have 1 or 2 committees. If you have 1 committee, yes. The investment committee really looks at plan design as well. And as long as you're having somebody, again, using it as a training opportunity, it really explaining what those features do and the ripple effect. For example, if you're failing your testing every year and you're highly compensated or getting refunds, really the benefit of auto features, but also the fact that it might take 3 years for these auto-enroll features to catch up to where it really will be a benefit, and looking at different options like that. Now, if you have 2 separate committees, it might be more your admin committee that looks at that type of thing, but if not, yes, I would definitely have that as part of your investment committee.
Okay, wonderful. And I think you answered one other question that had come in. I think you answered it at the end, Sarah, about the document that you said you were going to provide about how to know if your advisor is doing all these things that you recommend.
Yes, we'll include the, I can just go ahead and include, I'm going to be following this up tomorrow. Kelly will have all of, will send me everybody's contact information, and I'll send you a sample agenda. I'll also send the slides and just a few pieces of information that would be helpful, including a piece on meeting minutes. But I'll also go ahead and include that due diligence evaluation. And if you have any questions, feel free to just email me directly back, and I'm happy to answer anything.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. We so appreciate your time today. And audience, thank you for being here with us. It was a great webinar. Sarah, you gave a lot of really detailed, great information. And we hope if anyone's interested that they'll join us in Austin. Sarah will be there, as will her other colleagues from SWBC, and it's going to be a great conference. So again, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, audience, for joining us today. And we'll be in touch tomorrow via email with all the credit information as well as the other resources that Sarah mentioned. Thanks again, Sarah. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.